recorded, or you just don't say anything. And yeah, Carsten, could you please briefly introduce Aaron to us?
Sure. So it's my pleasure to introduce Aaron Ellison today. Aaron has been for a long time working at the Harvard Forest as a deputy director and general, I guess, factotum of science. Aaron's career, you know, there's hardly an ecosystem he hasn't worked on. And the interesting bit, well, there's many interesting bits are that he tries to leverage the understanding from one system to the next. So it's not good enough to know that what a salt marsh looks like, or mangrove, or a pitcher plant, but rather to make the connections in between. There are many things, and you can download his 250-page CV from his homepage. But the thing that I find particularly interesting is that Aaron has been for 6 and a bit years editor of ecological monographs. And as you all know, ecological monographs means long papers. So it's not just, you know, flicking through 10 or 20 pages and say, oh, I don't like that, but it's flicking through 80 or 120 pages and saying, oh, there's something interesting in that. And it takes a lot of stamina to do that for many years. And the flip side, the productive side, so to speak, of that is that Aaron also likes writing books about very different topics, from ants to, say, the last one is on pitcher plants. And yes, I know Aaron from, various conferences over the years. And one of the things that we keep returning to is ecological statistics. Surprise, surprise. And so although this is the time slot of our statistics cafe, it's actually more an ecology talk today. And although Aaron has retired from his position in Harvard, he's, I don't think, not showing any signs of slowing down, at least not visibly. And so I'm very curious to see where his current thinking may take us over the next half hour or so. Thanks again, Aaron, for joining us.
Thank you very much. Can you all see the main slide, the title slide? Is that up where it ought to be?
Yep.
Okay. So thanks for that introduction. I would point out one amendation, as it were, which is that I gave up ecological monographs a few years ago. One should never run a journal for more than 7 or 10 years. And I am now executive editor as editor-in-chief of Methods in Ecology and Evolution. So I just can't give up the editing. And in my retirement, in addition to various fellowships that have kept me traveling and will keep me traveling for the next couple of years, I also started a company called Sound Solutions for Sustainable Science, which does project management for scientists and tries to do science, help people do better science. Today's talk is a bit of a hybrid. It's actually a little bit more philosophy than it is ecology or statistics, although I will touch on both ecology and statistics in the talk. This is the result of a long-term collaborative project with Ayelet Shavit, who's the chair of philosophy at Tel Hai College in Israel, and also has an appointment at the Technion in Israel. And she is a philosopher of science. She and I edited a book a few years ago on replication and repeatability in science. And our current project is on diversity and heterogeneity and how to understand the difference. And I'll start off by saying that this really is a philosophy talk in the sense that I'll be paying a lot of attention to language that in the way that philosophers think about it, and that I'll play a little bit fast and loose with ecology and statistics, but we'll come back to that at the end. And in addition to the strong collaboration with Ayelet, we've brought in 2 additional collaborators on the project, Wesley Dattilo from Mexico, and my other colleague, Sam Ma, in China and in Kunming. And again, as an aside, Sam has just completed a Chinese translation of our primer of ecological statistics, and that'll be available throughout China next month. So I know that we've all been struggling with Zoom talks for the last, I don't know, what feels like forever. And I know that we lose our attention span when we're watching Zoom talks, and it's easy to just sort of take a break. And so I always now start my Zoom talks with the take-home messages so that you get the main points. And if then you want to go have a cup of coffee or whatever, mute or do whatever you want to do, that's fine. You've at least gotten the key take-homes. And so the key take-home message, if you leave today's talk with one meme in your mind, it's the idea that a zoo is diverse and an ecosystem is heterogeneous. And I'm going to spend the next 25 minutes taking that sentence apart, because that's the key take-home message of paper that Ayelet and I published a couple months ago now. Subset to that is the notion that what we will refer to here as heterogeneity is a special case of diversity, and that currently we care a lot about diversity and equity, inclusion, belonging, justice in the public sector, in the private sector, in the academy, in the governments. And we really focus a lot on diversity. And I want to make the point, and I'll probably make it a little harder than need be, that diversity doesn't necessarily lead to any of these other values and goals that we have. Moving into ecology, I'll talk a little bit about how we currently understand heterogeneity in ecology, which is basically spatial and temporal arrangement of diverse entities. And that the take-home, the conclusion after all of this is that that's not enough. And we need to not only deal with diversity, but we need to deal with interactions and integration in ecosystems, which sounds self-evident to an ecologist, but ecologists don't actually do that as much as they should, and that reflects my 40 years of assessment of the and being in the field. All right, so let me give you a couple of examples to start. You all are in Germany, and so I hope some of you have managed to visit the Tierpark Hagenbeck in Hamburg. I haven't actually been there, but the next time I get to Germany, I'm going to go see it. Hagenbeck developed the idea of what he called the panorama design for zoos back in the early 1900s. And his idea was to create these paradise environments where the animals could live together and be happy, very Garden of Eden-like, where the lion lies down with the lamb and there isn't any fight for survival. And the initial implementation of this was in Hamburg, and it's still there. And so I'll zoom in on the photograph here. This is the Africa exhibit at the Tierpark. And it is divided up into regions, ecological regions. You've got the birds and on the steppes and the gorge and the tar rock and the mountain goats and all of these things. And this is a photograph from the 1930s. Alex Felsen, a colleague of mine in Melbourne, a landscape architect, and I did a paper where we took apart this and a couple of other figures and ideas in urban ecology. But this is what it looks like today. This is a beautiful place to go visit. And you've got the lions and the leopards and the panthers and the zebras and the birds, and everything seems to be living there in perfect harmony. And it's very diverse, right? They got a whole bunch of different birds, they got different carnivores, they got different herbivores, they got wonderful plantings. It's like your ecological idea of diversity. And it's an illusion. It's a complete illusion. And so here, I imagine you can see my mouse pointer here, the little hand. This is the image that you see if you're actually standing here where my pointer is, looking up at the rocks, and you've got the bird pond, and then there's the path, and then you've got the African steppe where you've got the herbivores, and then there's the path and a fence, and then you've got the lions, and you've got a path and a fence, and you've got some goats. And so everything is nicely separated so that it gives the illusion of harmony, and it gives the idea that the system is diverse, but it it's not actually a functioning ecosystem. It's a zoo, but it is diverse. And so Ayelet and I, in this paper that we wrote, that we published in the Journal of Philosophy. Now, as an aside, I'm a scientist, I'm an ecologist. I don't know from philosophy journals, but Ayelet assures me that publishing a paper in the Journal of Philosophy is like a scientist publishing a paper in Science or Nature. And so I guess it's a pretty good paper. And so, but our tagline in that paper is that a zoo is diverse, but an ecosystem is heterogeneous. And so here's a picture of actually an ecosystem where you have all these same creatures and the same kinds of structures and vegetation, but there are no barriers. And the lions can get at the zebra and the wildebeest, and there you go. So this is a great puzzle. You know, we talk a lot about diversity, but we're not so interested when we talk about diversity in how the diverse entities interact with each other. And so in our exploration of this, we took a look at how how diversity and heterogeneity are used in English. We looked at about 1 billion word combinations in the corpus of contemporary American English and the Wikipedia corpus. And this sort of reinforced our initial idea that diversity applies to aggregated collections or populations and refers to distinctions between entities like race, ethnicity, geography, biodiversity, the different kinds of things, the diversity of objects. Like you would talk about there, wow, there's a real diversity of paintings and hanging on the wall, or there's a great diversity of animals in the zoo. But people use heterogeneity very differently. Now, this is not statistical heterogeneity. This is not ecological heterogeneity. This is how people who are non-specialists use the idea of heterogeneity. And heterogeneity is applied to collectives and includes interactions among things or among different individuals. And so this refers much more frequently to the ideas of inclusion and belonging in human groups and in objects working together to form a whole, so that you think about a cell as a heterogeneous collection of organelles that are all working together to do something to make that cell work, or that you have a heterogeneous collection of organisms in a body and you get a functioning individual. We would not say that we have a diversity of organs in our body. We would not say that there's a diversity of organelles in a cell, although of course there are many different kinds of organelles. And in fact, if we think about the ideas of collectivity, wholeness, integration, or interaction, these are used much more commonly to describe heterogeneous systems than they are diverse systems. And you can, when you do text mining on these things, this significantly improves your prediction to put those terms into the heterogeneous box instead of the diverse box. And so as we went through this, we thought more about how we might think about the concept of heterogeneity related to the concept of diversity. And so we argue in our paper that heterogeneous should apply only to collectives and their comprising entities, the things that make up the heterogeneous group or collective, as long as there are 3 other conditions. That is, that you have differences, that is diversity among the entities of which your collective is composed. So you actually have a bunch of different things, but they interact with each other and they're integrated into a complex collective structure. And so then you can see from this that an entity that is diverse, like a zoo, could be heterogeneous, but it might not be heterogeneous. But on the other hand, a heterogeneous entity must also be diverse. Okay, so that's the take home of heterogeneity as a special case of diversity. Now, I gave a version of this talk at the University of St. Andrews last month. I was a fellow there for a month in Scotland, and at St. Andrews, like at Harvard, like at Freiburg, the universities are very invested in diversity and ideas of diversity. So this is a snapshot from today. I went onto Freiburg's website. I just did a quick search on diversity, and these are the things that popped up. You have a gender and diversity portal under the office of the vice president or the provost, and you have a topics and focus on gender and diversity. And there's a tag here. It says the University of Freiburg regards itself as a place of pluralism, open-mindedness, and international exchange. So of course, I'm very much looking forward to being there as someone from somewhere else. And they go on about how they encourage attainment of equal opportunity, respectful approach to diversity, etc. And then they laud the fact that they signed the, I don't even know how to pronounce this, the Charta der Vielfalt in 2009. And so I went and looked that up, and right at on the front page of this declaration is their dimensions of diversity. And here's their pie chart of dimensions of diversity, promoting the recognition, appreciation, and integration of diversity in business culture and presumably in universities as well. And it's all these different categories. It's age and social background and ethnicity and all the different axes of diversity that we can slice things up into. There's no sense on a chart like this that any of these different pieces interact in any way. And when I talk about interact in any way, that's very different from what people who work a lot in the diversity field talk about intersectionality. Intersectionality just means in a lot of ways you've got multiple components of diversity, but it's not the interactions that we think about when we think about heterogeneity in the way we're using it here, or inclusion or belonging. And so when we look at how businesses and organizations think about diversity, inclusion, and belonging, the first thing they talk about when they're talking about diversity is that it's just like biodiversity. Diversity and biodiversity are the same thing. You have a bunch of varieties of different organisms in a particular habitat or ecosystem, and diversity between people can be understood as the presence of difference. It's that simple. And then at the core of inclusion is diversity. And so that means that if you want to start bringing people together, they actually have to feel like they belong in the same room. Doesn't mean they're interacting with each other, but at least they have a seat at the table. And then when we talk about equity, well, everyone's behaving more or less the same way. And if we actually get the overlap over all of these things, then you have an organization that is actually working in a heterogeneous way. Now, why does this matter? If we look at diversity and heterogeneity in ecology, and my own field and many of your fields, in the United States, ecologists are not very diverse. All right, this is the data from 2020. The United States National Science Foundation does an annual survey of earned doctorates. And so this is the data of earned doctorates for ecology, environmental, and evolutionary fields in 2019, because the survey was done in 2020. And you can see all the different fields of ecology and environmental and science and evolutionary biology. But the bottom line is, at least in the United States, it's all one ethnic group. It's not very diverse. It's certainly not very heterogeneous, because we don't even have the diversity to begin working our way up to heterogeneity here. And we're constantly working at this in all our universities and in all our countries to be more diverse in the field. But just because you're more diverse doesn't mean you're more, in this case, heterogeneous. And I refer here to two different things. One, a book by my former colleague, Beverly Tatum. She was acting president at Mount Holyoke College when I taught there in the 1990s. And she wrote a book called "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?" Right? And the idea being that you can have all the diversity you want in the university, in the organization, in the schools, but then you have the different groups that all isolate themselves in a way that we might refer to as assortative partitioning or assortative pair bonding in evolution. you still have diversity, but you don't have interaction, you don't have heterogeneity. And now we all have on our labs and our bulletin boards, we all have, you know, the values, all the values that we have about diversity in our labs and in our work. But that doesn't mean that when you actually walk into the lab that you have a functioning and interacting environment. So if it's a little bit uncomfortable or a little bit strange to be talking about all these things that we deal with in people, let's step back and finish up and talk about what we really think about when we talk about diversity and heterogeneity in ecology. And there are two sort of canonical textbooks from which all studies of diversity and heterogeneity in ecology derive from. The first is Anne McGurran's book, published in, I think, 1989, on ecological diversity and its measurement. She did an update in 2015 with a bunch more contributors and data, but fundamentally the same. In the basic underlying arguments. And 2 years later, Kalasa and Stuart Pickett published a book on ecological heterogeneity. And so in the late 1980s, early 1990s, this is when we really started talking about these particular topics in the field. And Anne McGurran defined ecological diversity as the variety and abundance of species in different habitats and communities. So it's like the pie chart. It's like the zoo. It's how many you have. Species richness, absolute and relative or proportional abundances, habitat diversity, species turnover, beta diversity, gamma diversity, partitioning of diversity, all these different ways of enumerating the different kinds of things that we have. And I did spend a month at St. Andrews. I was based at the Center of Biodiversity that Anne directs. And, you know, I spent many hours talking with her about this. And fundamentally, you know, I basically said, Anne, do interactions matter in your ideas of ecological diversity? And her response to this, you know, was, I got to think about that. Right? You know, that just isn't how we think about this. I'm like, okay, that's great. You know, there is consistency there in the field. Ecological heterogeneity, again derived from Kalasa and Pickett, is the difference or diversity in kind or arrangement of component elements or constituencies. And so then they go on and say that this can happen in both space and time. So heterogeneity is just, in this case, a special case of diversity. It's just how things are arranged, whether they're arranged in space or arranged in time. But they're still not talking much about interactions. And having spent much of my career working on food webs and how food webs and things in food webs interact, it is remarkable to me that folks who study diversity and heterogeneity ignore about 50% of what I think of as ecology, and vice versa, right? The people who study food webs don't really think a lot about ecological diversity or heterogeneity in this or any other way. So Kalasa, in their introductory chapter to the Kalasa and Pickett, he and Royo came up with some different ideas about heterogeneity and asked, you know, where these discontinuities came from, to look at these different arrangements of things in space and time, whether it was deterministic or random or chaotic. But it's basically pattern recognition as opposed to process of how these things come about, although they recognize that they would need to understand the processes to get at the pattern, but there's still much work to be done there. They also came up with they reviewed about 30 or 40 different ideas of heterogeneity. They collapsed them into 2 or 3 different classes of heterogeneity. One they called the dual view of heterogeneity, which I think is a very interesting idea, that would be interesting to distinguish the effects of a homogeneous environment on a heterogeneous population from the other way around. And Zhanshan somewhat earlier had said, well, this would be an interesting way to think about invasion biology and thinking about the interactions in this case in a homogeneous environment when you have heterogeneous individuals interacting that would tell us something about how the system works. And so there's an early glimmer of the idea that interactions matter in thinking about diversity and heterogeneity. Colassa and Rollo also came up with an idea of the integral view of heterogeneity, and they said at the time, this is 1991, a budding framework for the study of functional heterogeneity, we could substitute for that functional diversity, is based on recognition of hierarchical structures of systems. And they gave an example reflecting back to the Serengeti here that, within a population of lions, you actually have the idea of heterogeneity in the way that Ayelet and I have been talking about this, where you actually have interactions among the entities that give rise to the kinds of properties of the system. So in the last 2 years, as Ayelet and I were working on the philosophical argument about this, we started thinking about how we might operationalize this in studies of ecology. And while we were thinking about this, Wesley Dattilo and his students published a paper in Diversity in the MDPI journal about measures of interactions. And he and his students pointed out that, in fact, diversity is more than just species or interaction richness. It's more than richness is the key thing. And so he argued that we should be trying to understand interaction diversity as well. And he came up with an initial first pass at how one might quantify interaction diversity in bipartite networks, where we have quite a lot of data on things like plant pollinator networks or plant herbivore networks. And the second attempt to look at these kinds of interaction diversities, or these diversity, bringing interactions into ideas of diversity, in the book that Nick Catelli and I published summarizing our quarter century of work with Sarracenia, we argued that one might be able to use the idea of ascendancy of a network, in this case of an entire food web, not just a bipartite network, which is a measure that Bob Ulanowitz came up with again in the 1980s. There's a good review in 2004 on this that combines the idea of the kinds of entities in the system, the organization of the system, the interactions in the system, and the information flowing through it. And we thought that combining that with some of our ideas about diversity, what would happen if we actually looked at the relationship between diversity and ascendancy, in this case, the log of ascendancy, to get it on a similar scale, which we use as a shorthand now for ecological heterogeneity. And the plot of that, shown on the right here, shows that they're not directly related to one another. It's an asymptotic function, so that you can have lots and lots of diversity, but the way a system is organized and can interact functionally in terms of those interactions, there's actually seems to be an upper bound on that. And Ulanowitz had actually hypothesized that back in his 2004 paper, and we then support this idea with a synthesis of over 400 food webs from the ecological literature. So this is very much a work in progress. We're trying to figure out where to go with this next, and how to bring these ideas to the fore in ecology, and think about what kinds of experiments and studies and data we would need to really understand and move beyond just counting different entities and just going whole hog for biodiversity or functional diversity or phylogenetic diversity, and actually thinking about how these things work together and interact in the systems. So I'll stop there. We can have some discussion about this, and I look forward to some time in Freiburg next year where we can work on this and other ideas together. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing and we can chat. And I kept the time.
Peter, do you take charge?
You can take over.
Okay. Questions? So, Jono.
So I was just wondering how you feel about the word complexity in this context, because I think that's my kind of banner for similar kinds of ideas. And I'm not an ecologist, but occasionally I mull over what role informational complexity plays in terms of our understanding of ecosystems. So just wondering what you thought about that.
So that's a really good question. And so one of the things that I had the wonderful opportunity to do when I was at St. Andrews, and one of the great things about having retired now is that I can actually sit down and read for a change, which is something I haven't done a lot of in the last, however many years. You spend all your time writing grants and doing things, but actually to sit down and read papers. And so I read a whole mess of papers to try and understand the history of where these ideas about diversity, heterogeneity, interactions came from in the ecological literature. And this idea of complexity that comes up very early in the papers in the 1970s and early 1980s when Ulanowitz and his group were working on these ideas of network complexity and system complexity. I mean, we talk about systems biology now, and that's all molecules and things like that. But keep in mind that the idea of systems theory comes out of complexity theory, information theory, and ecology in the 1950s, right? And so this is deeply embedded in this literature, and it's a whole branch of ecology that it's not mainstream ecology. It's all published in like ecological modeling and Journal of Theoretical Biology, where most ecologists, much less statisticians or computer scientists, bother to go read it. And they're very in groups of papers. They've got 10 people and they all cite each other all the time. But the ideas about information, all of this derives early from the work at Bell Labs that Shannon was doing and Weiner was doing. And then this was ported almost wholesale into ecology in the 1960s and 1970s. And so the underlying mathematics of that is almost identical, right? So it's just, and this is one of the real challenges, is that the language that each one of these groups uses is completely different. And a great project would be to sit down, and I'm working on a short paper right now that I might try and put a table like this in to try and map all the terms from information theory and complexity theory and statistics and biology and ecology, and see what they're all trying to say with different words that are basically the same mathematical constructs. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the parallels are completely there.
Michael.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that inspiring talk. I tried to connect your talk with a kind of well-known hypothesis in ecology, which is called often the heterogeneity biodiversity hypothesis, stating, that in more heterogeneous environments, we find more species due to higher niche availability or larger niche gradients and so on. So how can I connect your thinking about the terms diversity, heterogeneity with that idea of more heterogeneous environments are more diverse?
Right. So this is, so if we look at how Kalasa was thinking about heterogeneity and how ecologists continue to think about it. I mean, we basically think about heterogeneous environments. And when we think about heterogeneous environments in the language that I'm using here, we're thinking about diverse environments, right? Because the environments aren't interacting with each other. You just have a lot of different kinds of them. And so you have a lot of different kinds of environments, and in the different kinds of environments, you can have different things. And so then the sort of evolution of that in the literature and the ideas, it gets linked in with meta populations and meta communities, and whether you have different kinds of patches or similar kinds of patches, and how the different kinds of populations either work in these heterogeneous patches or how heterogeneous populations work in homogeneous patches. But it lacks, other than the processes of dispersal between the heterogeneous environments, between the patches, there are no interactions between them. Everything happens in the patch. And so, you know, it's one step, but I'm still fighting to find the interactions in there. But that's where that has gone to and progressed.
Jochen?
Yeah, I still have somewhat. It was a very nice, thought-provoking talk, but the talk, I think I still have problems connecting to this concept of heterogeneity. Maybe because most of us are not native speakers, we are not so used to that. But so you made the point that the ecology uses heterogeneity in a different meaning that's more kind of the same as diversity, but other fields use it in a way that has this interaction and inclusion, integration, so more. Can you give some more examples? So from a quick search, I found more like, of course, it focuses on the entity, and that there's some differences, and it's not homogeneous, but so can you give some examples of the use of the word or some fields where this is most clearly seen?
No. No, I can't. And this is you know, so this is the first place that we're trying to push this and trying to figure out where to go next with this. It's a really critical question that you've asked. And there are two pieces there that I want to address. The first is the language piece, right? One of our questions that we were unable to address in the philosophy paper, and not for lack of trying, but we just couldn't find a colleague to help us with it. But we'd actually like to explore how these ideas of different kinds of things and interactions among the different kinds of things are understood in different languages and different linguistic groups, right? So, you know, your question about, you know, as a not a native speaker of English, it's hard to figure this out. Yeah, I totally get that. And I'm really curious to think about, okay, in different language groups, how do people think about collections of entities that are just lots of different things and collections of entities that work together as collectives? Right? In English, where we've done the text mining, people clearly use these terms differently. Right. So when you think about collective farms or kibbutzes in Israel, you think about heterogeneous organizations. Right. But I don't know how that plays out in other language groups. And I certainly don't know how it plays out in other fields. I mean, it's bad enough that I messed around with philosophy and statistics. And statistics is a great example, because when we talk, we're really precise in statistics about homogeneity of variance and heterogeneity of variance, right? Homoscedasticity and heteroscedasticity, where we're talking about equal and unequal or different, right? And so we actually went through and I'm happy to, I'll send a copy of the paper to Karsten and he can distribute it. We spent a fair amount of footnote time in the paper talking about how we're not talking about what statisticians talk about when we talk about heterogeneity here, but statistics uses heterogeneity in a very, very specific way, and at least it's consistent. Ecologists are all over the map, so it's a real pain in the neck. Cell biologists are all over the map, so there's just a lot of sloppy usage there. So the short answer is no, I can't give you good examples, and yes, I'm really interested in finding them.
So if I may lead on from that, in the old days when everything was better, like in the 50s, 60s, the Odum school looked at energy and material fluxes in ecosystems. And in a sense, my reading of that, or perusing, I should say, of the literature is that they had the idea you need different compartments, different things to make an ecosystem work. You need something to take up the nutrients, some to break it down, some assimilation, some dissimilation, and so forth. So in a sense, the diversity of organisms and the heterogeneity of the system was required to make it work. So there it was both. You needed, and then sort of the next step was to say, okay, so we need to find an indicator of a nice ecosystem. It works properly, and oh, look, it has a lot of species. And then the focus switched a bit towards the diversity business. And then the integration that you have now mentioned sort of got lost. And then people started looking at the interactions, but not with respect to functioning of the system, but just like, oh, A eats B, but not necessarily to produce a higher amount of biomass or faster turnover of nitrogen or whatever. And what you're now calling for is, in a sense, to step back and put the aim or the goal or the functioning of the ecosystem back into the frame and link these different elements together again. Is that correct?
Well, in part, yes. And you know, one of the challenges with Odum's initial approach, I mean, Odum was really good about actually identifying that the organisms mattered with all of the fluxes as well. And you identified one strand here, which is that people looked at this and the indicator was that when you had a lot of species, this worked better. So let's go look at a lot of species. The other strand was that you don't have to worry about the species at all. All you have to do is worry about the throughput, right? And so there's a whole nother strand of ecosystem ecology that completely dropped the idea of species or diversity at all. And all they do is measure, you know, stuff in and stuff out. And so Ulanowicz's work was the sort of one blip on that ecosystem thread where he tried to bring the species back into it. And he's, you know, as retired as I am, only more so. At Gainesville, he's still working and thinking and writing books, but he's really off in left field in the ecosystem world, just as I'm sort of out in left field in the food web world. But yes, and in part, one of the things that I worry about or I'm concerned about is the emphasis in conservation is so heavily on biodiversity and in just making sure we have all of these things represented. But if they're not interacting and working together to actually make the system function, what good is this biodiversity, right? You got 2 rhinos left, you got 10 tigers left, and you got 1 patch of mangrove forest left, and you say, wow, I've protected biodiversity, but you don't have anything, right? I've spent my career working all around the world, among other things, looking at mangrove forests. And I remember I was in Malaysia in 1996. I was in Malaysia, in Penang, in some mangrove forests. It's marvelous, diverse mangrove forests. They got 20, 30 species of mangroves, as diverse a mangrove forest as you have anywhere in the world. And they were justifiably proud of these forests that they were managing for diversity. And there were no mangrove crabs in this forest. Now, if you've worked in salt marshes or you worked in mangrove forests, crabs are doing all the oxygenation of the soil, right? And the peat. And you've got, in a functioning mangrove forest, maybe you got 50 or 75 species of crabs. The idea that you could have a beautiful, diverse mangrove forest that was essentially a dead-end forest, it made an incredible impression on me. Just the idea that we've done all this work to protect the trees and we don't have a system. We don't have an actually functioning mangrove forest. So I in some sense, I push back a little against we just have to protect biodiversity at all costs. It's like, I can have a stamp collection too, and that's not what I really want. So there's something in the chat here I wanted to see about. I think in German, heterogen is used as in statistics, something being variable, different, but not involving interactions. Would others agree? I don't know. And then the follow-up question to that is, what would be the word in German that would apply to collectives?
So my impression is that when I use the English word heterogeneity as a German, I use it with a negative connotation. So typically, if a system is homogeneous, it's nice and easy and manageable, right? So heterogeneity brings in all the mess. And then we don't understand something, and then we say, oh, it's because the system is heterogeneous. And so it's the intrinsic messiness or variability. And but otherwise, I would agree that heterogeneous in German, heterogen, would only mean variable, really. Yeah. So I think it may be also.
But what would a good Marxist collective? How would you refer to that in German?
Can you repeat that again? A good collection of what?
A good Marxist collective. How would you refer to that in German? Natalie, Janice, Janine writes Menge. I don't know what that is. I don't know German. I need to learn German.
Well, no, Max's collective.
Anyway, we'll be able to explore this next year. System Einheit.
Well, I mean, in the political sense or social sense, you would say commune or collective, right? So you would have if you have a leftish group of people who work collectively in improving the world, you may call them a commune, but that doesn't transfer to science, I guess, to natural sciences.
Not yet.
There's also in both languages integrated and this set of words.
Yeah.
I think the Gemeinschaft, community, that would be maybe so. In German, Gemeinschaft, which we usually translate to community, that holds some of this, that it's, working together.
Yes.
Interestingly, at odds with the usually ecological definition of community, which is just, the stamp collection of your survey.
Well, and I think that's another important point, right? Is that ecological communities, and I'm classified, as it were, as a community ecologist. An ecological community is usually at a single trophic level, so like birds or ants or plants. And so you don't even have any trophic interactions in an ecological community. And that's an interesting, so that then you have community ecologists being isolated from food web ecologists who work with trophic levels because the theories don't match. So.
Okay, so we'll take the time to think about a proper set of words in various languages by the time that you arrive here in Freiburg.
That'll be great.
We have a few speakers of various, at least European languages around. I'll come with at least a Romanian, not Romanian, but Roman, that's the right word, I guess, Roman-based set of languages. Latin-based, romanische Sprachen, Roman languages. Romance? We'll have some romance as well. Yeah. So thank you very much, Aaron, for this thought-provoking talk. And I think we'll keep returning to that time and again. And indeed, it would be very nice if you could send me the PDF of the Journal of Philosophy, which I haven't subscribed to yet.
No surprise there. Me neither. I didn't even know it existed, right? So, but Ayelet is very excited to have a paper there. So I thought that was fine.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right. And send me a copy of the recording. I'll get it posted.
And as you know, dear audience, this was the kickoff, and it was sort of out of sync. So we have the next ENE seminar already next week, Wednesday again at 1:15. Peter, can you give the title?
Yes, it's a talk by Leonard van der Peppel, a new postdoc in my group, who will talk about ancestral predisposition toward a domesticated lifestyle in termite cultivating fungi. So he works on fungus cultivating termites, or worked. Now he works on bark beetles.
That sounds great.
Okay, then thank you very much, everybody, for participating, and all the best.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.